In this video, I'm going to go over the research methods in psychology. So this is the second video that I've done in a series that I'm doing on Psychology 101. So this is just kind of a basic series where I just go over like core concepts within psychology. And I think I'm going to make about 12 or 13 of them. I'm not sure yet, but this is the second video. So we're going to go into research methods in psychology. So let's just start out straight away. I think it's important to, even though this might sound like more of a boring topic compared to the other topics, like next week I'm going to do learning, and then later on we're going to do memory and so forth. But I think it's important to understand, just the basics of the terminology for understanding research methods in psychology, because we need to be able to analyze the data that we see, analyze different studies that people share and stuff like that. So I think that all this helps us to just become more critical thinkers, and it's just good to have that broad general knowledge of what goes into research and what it actually means, because sometimes we can give too much credence to particular research and not enough credence to other research. And so it can be very confusing out there with conflicting opinions. And so, psychology is a scientific endeavor. So we want to try to understand, its limitations and its advantages as well, how it can be informative to us. So let's start off with the characteristics of scientific psychological research. If you understand these terms, the terminology of all these different things here, it'll help you understand how the research process in psychology, kind of unfolds. Okay, so these are typical characteristics. Of course, different research methods and designs. There's a vast majority. There's a vast, differences in all different types of designs that. An experiment or a certain set of research, is how it's going to be structured. It's going to differ. But in general, they all share, similar things to what is on the board here. So in general, we start with a theory. Okay, so a systematic way to structure our kind of knowledge and understanding of the world, or a particular part of the world, or how something operates. Okay, and then from that theory or that theoretical framework, we come up with a hypothesis. And so a hypothesis would be something more specific that we predict would happen if it's kind of like a prediction of what we think will happen. Okay, usually it's a prediction between the relationship between one or more variables. Okay, so for example, we predict that those people who have a higher IQ will do better at school. Okay, so you're predicting the relationship between these variables. Okay, and so there's a independent variable, which is the one that you manipulate in an experiment, and then a dependent variable, which is the one that is kind of measured to go either up and down with the dependent variable, or maybe there's no correlation or cause and effect at all. Okay, but yeah, so we have a general theoretical framework which has certain propositions within it. We develop a hypothesis that we want to test. So we come up with something that we want to, we predict something that we actually want to test and put to the test. How do we test it? We create standardized procedures. So when you create a procedure, it has to be, there's no use in giving, if you have a sample of 100 people, giving all 100 people a different kind of procedure to go through, then you're not testing the same thing. It has to be standardized, except for if you have a control group. Obviously the control group would do one thing, and then where you're testing the variables, they'll do another thing, okay? But it has to be standardized in each group. You can't have different members within one specific group just doing all completely random different things. It has to be a procedure that is standardized, in an experiment or in a survey or whatever you're doing. So it has to be a standardized procedure. And what's very important is generalizability as well. And so what makes something generalizable is that you need to have a good sample. Okay, so a sample is a subset of a population. Okay, so you want the sample to be representative of the population. You don't want it to be overly saturated with a particular kind of person that then makes your sample deviate so much from the norm. Okay, so like if in general in a given population there's 50-50 female and male, you don't want to end up with your sample like 98% males for some reason. Okay, so then that wouldn't be a good representation of the population. Okay, so if you have a good representation of the population, then that makes the sample generalizable, because now the study that is conducted on that specific sample is generalizable to the population, because the sample is indicative of those who live in the population. Okay, so that's why that's important. Also, it's important, the reason it's important to have that generalizability is so that the research findings are actually applicable outside of the laboratory. You don't want the research to only be so niche that it's only applicable to certain things. And I mean, I guess, we do have very niche things they're important. So if it's very important, like, not everyone has leukemia, for example, but if you've got some research to help specifically people with leukemia, I mean, like, it's valuable, it's generalizable to people with leukemia, but, we do want to make sure that it's relevant outside the lab. That's the main point. It has to be relevant outside the laboratory conditions, okay? Also, to do with generalizability, there's such thing as internal and then external validity. Okay, so external validity is that it's relevant outside of the lab. That's what external validity is. It's generalizable. It's valid because it's able to be generalized to the external world. Okay, and an example of internal generalizability would be like that sample representative of the population. If something in the design of it is not, if it doesn't actually test the hypothesis, then it's not generalizable because it's not internally valid. Okay, so the way that you set up your procedure and the way you set up conducting the research needs to be actually testing the hypothesis. Okay, so that's a critical point. Okay, you could set up a hypothesis, do something, and then it doesn't actually, misses the point. It doesn't actually test what the hypothesis predicted. Okay, so that's important. That's internal validity. And if it has that internal validity and external validity, then it has generalizability. All right, so that's that there. Now, once you've got that, you've also got objective measures. Okay, so measures are things that measure the variables. Okay, so the only one I can think of off the top of my head is an example of a measure is emotional intelligence. Okay, it has an emotional intelligence scale. That scale is a set of questions, so like a survey, that is designed in such a way that it is meant to measure the abstract idea of emotional intelligence. Okay, so an objective measure actually, is a way to kind of make tangible, to measure an abstract kind of idea. It doesn't always have to be abstract. It's just that with psychology, a lot of the time it is abstract. So so it has to actually, and it has to be reliable and valid. So it has to be reliable, meaning that it has to actually, across time, this particular measure has to produce similar results. Okay, so if I had a ruler is an objective measure. It's got centimeters and inches. If it didn't, always give me a similar result by using it, if the lines on that ruler were in all different random chaotic spaces across that piece of wood, then it wouldn't be reliable, because you wouldn't have that consistency of measure across times. Okay, and it also has to be valid. So it actually has to measure what it's purporting to measure. Okay, so it's similar to this, how this has to be the whole test, the whole testing the hypothesis has to be valid. The actual measure that measures the variable has to also be valid as well. It has to, like an IQ test, it purports to measure intelligence. So that has to be valid. It has to actually measure intelligence. And so then I guess you have to define intelligence and stuff like that. So that also comes into the theory and the presuppositions that you accept when you begin your research. Okay, so that's objective measures. All right, so let's move over to the research over here, quantitative and qualitative research. So with quantitative research, you're dealing with experiments, surveys to get the statistical data, and then with that data, we then apply statistical methods to that data to understand the relationship between different variables, and then we have to draw conclusions from that data. Okay, so quantitative research is normally deductive and objective. Okay, so it's objective in the sense that it's using statistical data, and it's deductive in the sense that it starts with a theory and a hypothesis, and then we are trying to use statistical data to test that hypothesis. Okay, so it's deductive because it starts with the framework, and then we look to see if that is the case, considering our investigation. All right. And now qualitative research is more observational, and it's more case studies. Okay, so either dealing one-on-one or small groups or multiple case studies compiled together. And you get qualitative data. Okay, so more explanatory, more in-depth, more like high-resolution data, because it's not kind of the statistical person, it's the actual person that you're talking to. Okay, and so it's normally inductive and subjective. It's subjective in the sense that the researcher has to make subjective judgments on the data. So they have to make the judgment of what the data means, because they are the person, conducting the case study. And so it's inductive in the sense that they don't start with the theory first, the hypothesis, but they start with, say, an observation or a particular question about, a given case. And through that observation, it's like an exploratory process where they then gain more information through the case study, through the experiment, sorry, not the experiment, but through the case study. And then through doing that, through observing, they can then come up with a theory or a hypothesis. So it's kind of like the opposite way around. So qualitative research can really help us get a lot of kind of insight into what we should then quantify and study statistically as well, if we can do that, because they each have limitations as to which would be more applicable depending on what you're trying to research, depending on the research question. Okay, so experiments are like the gold standard. okay? But not everything is generalizable to an experiment. Not everything you can't have a controlled environment all the time. And sometimes what you do in an experiment doesn't apply outside because the world is very complex, and psychological processes are very complex. So sometimes case studies are more appropriate, okay? Like sometimes to do with different cross-cultural studies and stuff like that. Even Jung, actually, if you think about it, he would go and visit different cultures and try to understand them psychologically through observation, through observing them, asking them about their dreams and stuff like that. That's an example of case studies. There's definitely subjective judgment going on there. But he's got the inductive reasoning through understanding and seeing particular manifestations of people and phenomena, and then trying to understand, by building up lots of different inductive, arguments and ideas to come to an overarching theory that then maybe we could quantify and study. So that's the characteristics of scientific psychological research. Now we're going to move on to digging deeper into experimental research and just laying out quickly how an experiment would take place. So experimental research, basically we do experiments and we're able to determine only from experimentation cause and effect. Okay, so all the other types of research like correlational studies and stuff like that, they can't determine causation. But with experiments, we are trying to look to understand cause and effect, and we do that through manipulating the independent variable and seeing what effect then it has on the dependent variable. Okay, and so that's establishing that cause and effect relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And so we do that through setting up an experiment where there's different conditions of the independent variable. Okay, and so depending on the different conditions of the independent variable, we'll be able to logically see how it impacts the dependent variable, okay, if it has an effect. Now, it's probably easier to just go through an example so then you would understand it. Okay, so there's some research done by Harry Harlow with infant monkeys, where they wanted to research and understand better why these infant monkeys were emotionally attached to their mothers. So we've got an observation, infant monkeys seem to be attached to their mothers. Why is that? There's two hypotheses that we have, or two theories that we have, okay, that we want to test to see which one's right. So the one theory is that the infant monkeys are emotionally attached to their mother because the mother is the source of food. It gives them, milk, gives them breast milk or whatever, and so it's the source of food. So that's one theory. The other theory is that the mother provides, that nurturing comfort for the infant monkey, and that emotional attachment comes through that comfort of clinging on to the mother. Okay, so there are two different theories, conceptual theories to explain a behavior. All right, but we want to conduct an experiment to understand better the relationship between the monkey and its emotional attachment with its mother. Right, and so what we do is, one hypothesis is that, so out of that, those two competing theories, we have one hypothesis that the monkey actually wants the comfort of the mother, and it won't matter if the mother gives it food or not. All right. So what they do is they basically have two surrogate mothers, and they get these infant monkeys in captivity, so they've been isolated from their mother, and they have two surrogate monkeys. One has cloth around it, very nice cloth around it, simulating the comfort of a mother monkey, and the other one has just this mesh, like a clear, just a clear mesh type stuff. So it's not as comfortable to cling on to. And in the two different conditions that they do, in one setting, they put the milk or the food, the milk bottle, onto the mesh mother, the uncomfortable mother. And then in another setting, they put the food or the milk bottle onto the cloth mother, the comfortable mother. And basically what they found is that the monkeys, it didn't really matter where they put the food, because the monkeys showed a clear preference for clinging onto the cloth mother, the more comfortable mother. So, that then shows that they have a preference for comfort. So then we can kind of, conclude that the infant monkeys are emotionally attached to their mothers because they desire that warmth and comfort from their mother. Okay, and so the independent variable is the placement of the food, because we can manipulate where we put the food, on the cloth mother, or on the mesh mother. Okay, and then the monkey's response, or more specifically the amount of time the monkey is holding on to each of the mothers, is the dependent variable. Okay, so if the mesh mother, the uncomfortable mother, had the milk on it, and the monkey was always over at that milk, and then we moved the milk back to the cloth mother, and then the monkey was always back near the cloth mother because the milk is there, then we could say, well, the monkey's behavior obviously is following the food, okay? But this, it didn't seem to really impact on the monkey. The cloth mother seemed to be the one that impacted on the monkey despite where the food was. Okay, so that proves the comfort theory through this experiment. So that's just a little idea of what an experiment can be like. And so we should be able to run this experiment again and again and prove the comfort theory correct. Okay, so it should be able to be repeatable. So it's not just a one-off random event. This particular monkey just, loved this cloth mother. It's, if we were able to replicate the study again and again, we'd get the same outcome. And so then we can be more certain of its validity. Okay, so descriptive research describes phenomena as they exist. So instead of doing an experiment and trying to manipulate a variable, the descriptive research just observes and describes what is being observed. Okay, so a case study, so examples of this are case studies, naturalistic observations, and survey research. Okay, so in case studies, they're in-depth observations. The sample sizes are normally pretty low, but you can kind of mitigate against that by doing multiple case studies. And so you get a high resolution, as I said earlier in the video, of the individual, of complex psychological phenomena, but you have a small sample size, so it might be, it might not be applicable to, people beyond the case study. And then, but it's really good, case studies are really good for generating hypotheses, so exploring the high resolution phenomena, so you can generate a hypothesis from that, and maybe you could then do some more quantitative research based on your observations. Okay, so you can generate theories, or you can do it the other way around. If you've done some quantitative research, but now you actually want to go, like for example, I remember this study on gambling, so there might be some quantitative research done on it, but now we would need to know actually how this research really impacts the lives of these people who are, say, entrenched in gambling or something like that. So to get that human perspective of what's going on with behind the statistics. Okay, so you can kind of use case studies, and experiments, and you can use multiple different methods of research and combine them together to make it more kind of robust, in your research. And then so you've got naturalistic observation. So that's referring to observing phenomena, particularly, I guess, animals or human behavior in a natural setting. Okay, so Frans de Waal researched a lot of chimpanzees and particularly, I think, in zoos, in captivity. So it's not really that naturalistic, but the things he observed seemed pretty natural to me. So he, one example is he observed one of the chimpanzees charging at another one, and then they were all kind of, silent for a while. They looked kind of distressed, and then later on they kind of came together and embraced each other. And so de Waal pondered about that and thought to himself, what could that mean? And then he came up with the idea of, he just witnessed reconciliation in chimpanzees. So just how humans, go to war and make peace. He tried to show that, from that observation, it revealed to him, from his perspective, that this innate ability to come together and kind of make peace is in us. Well, it's at least in the chimpanzees he observed. So that's an example of that. See, he wouldn't have known that if he didn't see that, through his observation. So it's like very inductive. And then Jean Piaget he's an awesome guy. He's really cool. He's kind of he's a bit of a strange guy, but I like some of his work. I want to delve deeper into it in the future. But there's so many different people. We've got to start somewhere. But he often observed children because he's known as kind of the most famous developmental psychologist, even though he kind of saw himself a little bit differently. But he studied. Would go and actually look at children in their natural setting, like in the playground, and how they interact with each other, what they say to each other, and stuff like that. So he actually observed that they, often are kind of like making statements or just talking about things and not really aware whether they're being heard or if they're actually directing their words to someone else. So, it's things like that he observed in children. And so that's a naturalistic observation. Another thing about this is, like, when you're observing something, the act of observing itself can influence even if it's slight, the behavior of the subjects you're observing. So, what you try to do is you try to be as non-intrusive as possible, so that you don't actually impact the behavior of the subjects you're observing. Also, you could be a participant, like an observer/participant, so then you're kind of undercover, so to speak, and they don't know that you're observing. So that's another way around to get around that. But also, a lot of it does comes back to researcher bias as well. Same as the case studies and naturalistic observation. There's research bias because the interpretation, say, is Frans de Waal's interpretation of what he saw, comes from him. So he has to make a interpretation, a judgment on what he is observing. Okay, so that's important to note there. And so then there's also survey research. So this is conducted through interviews or questionnaires. So there'll be a questionnaire of, are you, like, maybe it's a performance thing for a corporation and all their employees, and all the employees fill out a questionnaire about their morale, like how motivated they are at work, and they basically fill out different questions, and it asks, on this scale, are you, does this describe me well or not describe me well, something like that, right? And so they'd mark all their responses on the scale, answering all the questions, and then there'd be a statistical analysis done on that, and it would describe kind of, what's going on with the people in that corporation as far as morale. So it's important to get a random sample, because you don't want like a sample bias to throw off the research. Stratified just basically means that you want a stratified sample. So you have strata, so age, race, etc. If that's important, if those elements are important to have, make sure that there's like a random sample of age and race in there that's indicative of the population, then there would be a stratified random sample that would make sure to include on the basis of age, race, or whatever other metric you have. So it would make sure that that's included in that random sample, so the sample isn't just so skewed that you don't have appropriate representation of the population in there. Okay, and that would also depend on the specifics of the research that you're doing. So you might need a particular proportion of a population for a particular reason. Okay, so that's basically the descriptive research. So you describe phenomena as they exist, and it's descriptive. Okay, so it doesn't show causation. Like it can kind of hint at certain things. I guess if you do really in-depth analysis, you can come up with an argument as to why such and such is a certain way, but ultimately you can't really prove it. You can't, demonstrate that, because it needs to be something that can be, replicated as well, and empirical. Okay, so it can only describe what's happening. It can't, demonstrate with any force the causality of one variable into another. Okay, so correlational research is very common in psychology, and particularly correlational research is mainly administered through getting participants to take a lot of surveys and fill out questionnaires. And so a lot of the time we do this because it's a lot easier. It's very hard and expensive to set up experiments. It's easier to get a lot of people to fill out surveys. So a lot of the time in psychology, we do rely on correlational research. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine the degree to which two or more variables are correlated together. Okay, so knowing how much, knowing the value of one variable, how predictive is it of another variable? So if we know the value of your IQ, how predictive is that of your workplace success or something like that, or success at school, at passing exams? And so we measure this through a statistical technique called, or a statistical device called the correlation coefficient, which shows the extent or the strength between two variables. Okay, and so it literally means they're correlated. Okay, so how much these variables are related to each other. And so you can only ever get like a +1 all the way to a -1. Okay, so that's basically, or anywhere in between that. Okay, so if it's a +1, it's a positive correlation. So one value, if it goes up, it will positively increase the other variable and it will go up, okay? And -1 is like maximum negative correlation. So if one goes up, the other will go down. So they're negatively correlated. They are correlated, but they're negatively correlated. Okay, so they move in different directions. Okay, so you can see it going down there. All right, and now 0 means they're not correlated at all. They're not positively correlated or negatively correlated. There's no real relationship there. So that's basically all you really need to know for correlational research. Now, I think we'll just move on to ethics and we'll finish up with that. So lastly, we're going to talk about ethics in psychology research. So first of all, you need to get informed consent when you're conducting research. So they need to understand the purpose of the research and kind of what they're signing up for, and what the nature of the treatments, the nature of the research itself. Okay, so the person can give their consent to doing the research, and they're informed about what the research is. Okay, so that's important to be upfront in all your research designs. Now, sometimes there's deception involved. So to research a particular thing, you'll need to use deception. So you don't want to give away the aims of the research, because then that will kind of, influence the actual research you're doing and so how the participant behaves. So you use deception. Now, you often need approval, ethical approval for, I'm pretty sure, for all of your research that you do. And so that would have to pass, that deception would have to be, you'd have to back up a case as to why you need to deceive, because it can be, harmful to people to do that. And after the deception takes place, at the end of the study, you need to then console the person and make sure that, they're up to speed with what actually happened and why they had to deceive them and conduct the research in that particular way. And so, the number one thing in all research is do no harm. Okay, so in some of the early studies from John Watson, there's this famous study called Little Albert, and basically he did this classical conditioning studies, which we'll talk about in the next Psychology 101 video on learning and the behavioralists. And so basically John Watson did this, and his partner did this experiment with this little baby, he's known as Little Albert, and basically they slammed really loud instruments behind his head to kind of emotionally traumatize him, to condition him when he saw a furry rat. Every time he went to go after the rat, they'd slam this thing behind his head to make him cry. So he was all happy with the rat in the beginning, just playing with it, and then they conditioned him to fear the rat. So now where he saw the rat again, he was now scared of it. And so that's not ethical at all, because he suffered emotional damage and trauma. I think I looked into it, and I think it was taken from the mother, this baby. Maybe she wasn't even fully aware of what they were doing in the experiment. See, so there wasn't informed consent either. But this was done at the beginning of the 20th century. But yeah, so that would be something where, and I think that child, he actually ended up dying a few years later. I don't know if it's because of that experiment or not. We don't really know, but the idea is that you're meant to do no harm when you're conducting these experiments. In line with that, you want to uphold confidentiality, so you don't want to be spreading your research participants' information everywhere or anything like that. You want to make sure that you're doing the most you can to secure that information in a professional way. Animal research too, you need approval as well to to conduct experiments and research on animals, especially if it's going to harm the animals, even rats and stuff like that. I think the idea is you need to prove the benefit to humanity. So if there's a large benefit and they can see the board or whoever you're submitting the ethics proposal to can see that there is clear benefit, through doing animal research, then they'll approve it. Okay, so it's about that, how much damage are you doing versus how much reward and how helpful the research is going to be. So that's basically it for this, psychology research methods, psychology 101. So if you like this video, please subscribe. I'm going to be releasing more psychology 101 videos. Of course, I'm still going to be releasing videos on Carl Jung, and hopefully eventually we'll do other people, Freud, etc. So if you like that type of stuff, please subscribe, please share this video with other people, and have a look through my catalog of videos that I have. There might be something out there that interests you. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.